Welcome back to another episode of the Higher Love with Megan podcast, talking all things holistic health and mind, body, soul healing and expansion with me, your host, Megan Cooper. This episode features my lovely friend, Lucy. Lucy Puttergill spent 9 years working on the trading floor at Citi and subsequently JP Morgan before leaving in 2020 to start a business working with fellow overachievers to help them break free from the frankly limiting constraints of their own inner narratives so that they can become the people they've always dreamed of being. Her interest in holistic psychology led her to train not only as a transformational coach, but additionally as a breathwork facilitator, yoga teacher, and Ayurvedic nutrition consultant. She works with clients across these different modalities to help make lasting and real change in their lives. So welcome, Lucy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Such a pleasure. So obviously you have incredible wisdom about all things holistic, self-development and self-discovery, self-expansion. But for these conversations, what I'm really wanting to focus on is very much the kind of real life application and kind of where we've come from and challenges that we ourselves have overcome so that this can just be a really down-to-earth, open conversation. And I just saw on your Instagram just before I logged onto this call was that you reposted something by Bella Hadid, which I loved. And she was quoting something by Willow Smith. And I'm just going to read this because I think that this is a really beautiful thing. And I just wanted to speak to you about it. So Willow Smith wrote, that feeling of thinking that you're good enough or being insecure about your art is natural, but at the same time, I feel like it's taught. All humans are different. Every single human has something so special and unique to offer. And people forget that everyone is basically feeling the same way, lost, confused, not really sure why they're here. That anxiety, like everyone is feeling that and trying to cover it up in some kind of way. We're going to come together in our flaws, in our insecurities, in our joy, in our happiness, and accept that it's all beautiful and natural. I loved that. And I thought that it was really, really touching. And I thought that that would be a really good place to start because it's very much the approach that I'm going for with these podcasts of speaking to people that I have come across within my journey so far and speaking about our flaws to make them much more approachable. So I would just love to start off there and hear why that spoke to you.
Yeah, I mean, the initial reason it spoke to me was because I was just I wasn't shocked. I was like I felt really empowered seeing someone that has such an enormous following and such a huge platform being so open about her own struggles. But in you reading that back to me, something that really, really came through for me is that I spent a long time sitting in a space of like a shell. So trying to show this like perfect shell of myself and doing that pretty well, to be honest, like across different areas of my life, but always feeling this sense of loneliness. And always feeling this sense of like slight disconnection. At the time, I didn't know it was disconnection, but I felt like, how is it possible that I have like perfected myself in loads of different ways, but I still feel so empty? And it's actually been in connecting to the grittier parts of myself and the flaws and the sadness and all of the wounds and that stuff that has helped me connect to myself and in turn has allowed me to connect much more deeply with people around me. So it's that piece of like allowing yourself to go into the grit and understanding the grit of yourself then opens up this whole new world of connection. And I really do believe that it's in that grit and in the like shared experience of the challenges of life that we form community, really.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely connecting with our flaws. And I can completely resonate with what you said about maybe this is a symptom of kind of highly functioning humans, like high achievers, that we have this kind of perfect sheen and this kind of unattainable expectations that we hold ourselves to, and everything within our lives is kind of perfect and shiny. But yet when we feel this sense of, but I don't feel great on the inside, it just creates this disconnection because it's like a disconnection from self and then a disconnection from the outside world, because there's such a gap between what we're potentially showing and then what we're potentially feeling as well. So yeah, awesome. I think that's a brilliant place to start. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I loved watching it on Instagram, on Bella Hadid's account. So thank you. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to connect with you today was to hear a little bit about your background, because it's fascinating that you worked as a banker on the trading floor for 9 years, and now you've gone into the world of holistics and therapy and all the fields of different self-development and self-expansion. And it very much echoes the kind of transitions that I had of working as an insurance broker for 5 years and then becoming a yoga teacher and then kind of going off on my kind of self-development, holistic, spiritual journey. So we definitely have that in common. So I would just love to hear a little bit about your background, where you've come from, who you are, just a general overview of you.
Yeah. Right from the start or from banking life?
Let's go from banking, because we've only got 45 minutes.
Exactly. Full life story. So I graduated in chemistry, which was very random. And when I graduated, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I started working on the trading floor basically because I got given an opportunity through a friend of mine's cousin to start as a temp. So I was working in like client services as a temp for a while, thinking I'd do it for a bit and then go traveling. And then 9 years later, I was still in it, basically. And it's funny because I think I knew from the very beginning that something wasn't quite right. Like it didn't feel right in me. But coming out of university, like I felt like there was this big sense of that my success was going to be defined by basically how much money I made. And because banking paid really well, I was like, I'm on this path towards life success because I can see that it's going to pay me a lot. So I should be happy with this. Like in the bizarreness of my brain, it felt like I was on the like pinnacle path. Like this is the best path because it pays really well. So I kind of got stuck in it for lots of reasons we can dig into. But the initial one was like, this is, if I'm not happy in this when it pays so well, I'm surely not going to be happy in anything else because this is the pinnacle. This is the pinnacle of financial success. It's the pinnacle of like personal success because there's a slight, in my mind, there was a slight prestige to working in investment banking. And I kind of then got wrapped up in it. And if I'm honest, I think in my 20s, I probably didn't think about it very much. Like when I first started, I was like 22 or something, and I was just enjoying being paid quite well and going out and doing all the stuff. But then it was like there was this little hole inside me that then over time just got like more and more uncomfortable to a point where I was like, I need to look at this. And then I went through a variety of different like personal things that happened. So the initial thing, which I think for a lot of people is the case, is I went through a not particularly nice breakup and was in a space of like it wasn't really burnout, but I was just feeling not particularly great myself. And I started therapy. And then when I started therapy, it was like, oh my God, there's all this stuff. Like potentially I'm not just who I am. I have been like conditioned by things. That was the first time I think that I recognized that maybe the personality wasn't just like a fixed thing, that it was impacted by things in my past. And in doing therapy, then I started to unpick a couple of things. And then I got more and more interested in psychology and was like, okay, I need to really understand myself, because every time I started to understand myself more deeply, it felt like this big gaping hole inside of me was slowly closing. And I was becoming more and more connected to like deeper elements of myself. And then fast forward probably about 7 years, I ended up leaving, which is a whole other story. But it was definitely driven through this experience of like personal development and self-exploration and healing, really.
Amazing. Yeah, I love what you just mentioned in terms of feeling this hole, but actually it wasn't necessarily the external circumstances. It was something that was very much part of your own internal landscape, because obviously there are many things in our lives often which are not aligned with who we are at our core, you know, whether that's jobs, relationships, environment, you know, there are lots of different things that affect us on an external capacity. But actually what you're saying there, and something that you said to me in a voice note yesterday, which I loved, was it's actually not necessarily about these external things. It's about your internal landscape. And when you can do the healing on an internal level, then the external stuff doesn't seem to matter as much, or, you know, sometimes we don't have to change everything in our external world. It's actually just about going inward. So that's, exactly what you were saying there.
Yeah, completely. And it's really it is an internal journey. And I now look back and people I think it's really easy when you leave an industry, especially an industry like banking, for people to think that I'm now doing this job to slate banking. And it is not that at all. It's more that my experience of it was that I'm actually hugely grateful for having worked in it for as long as I did, because being in quite an intense environment forced me to look inwards, because it was almost it was so triggering to me that I was feeling all this pain inside of me, which was my own stuff to look at. But I sometimes wonder if I had been in another environment, or if I had been in maybe a less stressful job, whether I would have just carried on and not ever had the stimulus to look inward. But I really do believe that if you do all the work, I had a really interesting conversation actually when I left my job with a guy who's really senior in asset management. And he's really into healing, and he's done all his stuff, and he's super, super into spirituality and has his own practices. And he said to me, he was like, the thing is, Lucy, is when you've done it enough, and he was quite a lot older than me, he was like, you can work anywhere. It's just a case of when you become peaceful enough in yourself, you've looked at your own stuff, the external becomes irrelevant. It's never about the external. It's about your own experience of what's going on, which it's an inside job, really. And I probably haven't yet done enough of my own work to be in that space. But it's definitely an inside job.
I can definitely resonate as well of what you were saying of kind of, I'm on this life trajectory, and this life trajectory equals prestige and money, and therefore equals happiness and fulfillment. And that was something that I definitely experienced, you know, working in insurance, and I was about 5 years in, and I had worked my absolute ass off to get into working in fine art insurance. This was all I wanted, just to get a job in fine art insurance. And I was about 2 years into that, and then realized, oh shit, I'm still not happy. Oh my God. And at that point, it's like you've worked really hard at school, you've worked really hard at university, you've worked really hard in a career, and you've got to exactly the point that you thought would make you super duper happy, and still you're not happy. And it's like literally the whole kind of baseline falls out of your life slightly, and it's like, oh shit, am I actually stuck like this? Like, what's wrong with me type thing.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's a really scary place to be, because then you're like, is there just a part of my brain missing? Like, did someone switch off the happiness switch or something like that? Like, what do I need to do?
Yeah. So and it's so easy also to start to feel guilty. Like, I really remember thinking, I was like, I must be a terrible person, because I have had the most privileged life. Like, I really have. And I had this amazing job, and I had an amazing team. It's like, how is it possible? Well, that's when all of the inner critic starts coming up. Like, how is it possible that you're not happy? Like, you've got everything. Stop being so ungrateful. Be happier. And that's even worse, because then you're like, oh no, what do I do now?
And so easy as well for the conscious mind to step in and be like, maybe everything's fine. Let's just shove the feelings down. It's all good. We'll just cover it all up and make it shiny, you know? So,
oh God. I had an experience with a healer earlier this year, and she said to me, I was working with the Enneagram, which is an incredibly powerful tool for people working with, starting to look at their personality construct and stuff. And she was like, for your Enneagram type, which is a 3, it's like the biggest fear for you is for the shiny exterior to be cracked, and for people to see actually what a mess you are underneath. And I was like, oh God, the pain of it is so real. It's like, I've spent my whole life trying to pretend that I'm so shiny and perfect and high achieving, and I get A's all the time, and it's like inside there's this broken human, well, not broken human, but there is a lot of stuff that needed to be looked at.
That's so funny that you say that, because I actually went to go and see a shamanic healer, and she did a visualization for me. And what she saw was kind of me surrounded by light, but it was kind of like a pie chart, but it had a very small section of darkness, like very, very neat, very compacted into all of the light. And she was like, do you feel like you compartmentalize your shadow and your darkness? And I was like, no. Not at all. She was like, because it all needs to be integrated, the light and the dark. You don't need to pack up your anger and your sadness into little nice boxes. But I think that I think that is a trait of kind of perfectionists, high achievers. It's like we pack the shit up and put it away.
Yeah. And it's also like part of the danger for me anyway of starting to do this work is like, if I'm perfectly honest, the reason I started doing this work was so that I could find a man. Because I was like, I clearly have loads of issues. I get really anxious. I like freak out in relationships. Like I'm like undateable. So what I'll do is I'll go and perfect myself because, you know, that's a clever thing to do. But my theory was like, if I perfect myself enough, I'll no longer have any of this stuff. And then I'll be perfect. Basically, just like squish it all even further down.
Oh dear. Okay, two recovering perfectionists here having a conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was it, do you think, within that journey and within banking and stuff that made you create such a sizable change now to stepping into the arena that you're now in terms of your work with breathwork, with coaching, etc.? What was kind of was there a flick switch, or was it very gradual? What was the catalyst for it all, do you think?
So I think it's always like a slow progression. And it started, my view of this stuff, of like people that go through spiritual awakenings and things, is that, or get interested in personal development, or however you want to label it, is that they start pretty early. There's probably like an indication quite early that you're interested in stuff like this. And then through banking, I started to recognize I just wasn't very happy in myself. And I felt this disconnection from other people around me. I felt disconnected from life, really. And then I changed jobs, thinking that would make it better. Didn't work. And the flick switch, if there was one, was I did my yoga teacher training, which was again like, okay, it was almost like I was like climbing this ladder of like, let me just keep looking, but I'm going to stay in my normal life too, because I was a bit scared of what would happen if that wasn't there. And then it was bizarre. So I went on this retreat for a week in Italy, and I met two people that are now really close friends of mine. And in that week, one, I did a breathwork experience, which completely blew my mind. And I had some really intense conversations with one of the people that was there, one of the guy that is now a good friend of mine. And he was like, cruel to be kind. He was like, Lucy, if you didn't make a change right now, you're going to wake up in 10 years and be in the same position. And it wasn't so much about work. It was just like, you need to do your inner work kind of thing. It wasn't like go quit your job. It was just like, you need to start looking at what is causing all this angst. And then it was bizarre because on the way back from that retreat, I basically applied for this 3-month-long course in South America because I was like, it was almost like I had this body reaction to going back to London. I was like, I have to get out. Applied for this 3-month course in South America, which ended up being with a group of 30 people that were all really into personal development. And then in that 3-month period, had a few really, really intense personal experiences through various modalities. And then it was like my life completely changed. And I had to, it wasn't so much like, there was never like I hate this industry or I need to get out. It was just like, it was almost as if, I remember sending a text to my sister saying, it was like I woke up and I suddenly, having spent like 8 years being like, I need to leave my job, I need to do something different, but couldn't. It was like one day I woke up and I was like, I am no longer, this is not my path. It was so clear. It was just like, oh, I think I'm in the wrong place. Now I must leave. Mm-hmm. But there was no anger or anything. It was just like, okay, now my path is different to how it was before.
So it's not even so much about like just changing the job. It's like changing your belief systems and changing the patterns and changing your outlook and your perspectives, because then the job's irrelevant, right? It's kind of like it's just something that is in the road or not in the road, but it's actually about changing the whole like trajectory of the person, of who you are.
Yeah.
So what do you feel like was the reason that you weren't happy? I mean, you mentioned that you pushed a lot of kind of feelings down, that you had this like hole inside. What do you think the reasons were that you weren't happy? Like, what do you think was going on?
I think I was in a space where I was constantly looking for validation outside of myself. So I spent a lot of time, one, ignoring my feelings, and two, thinking that if I perfected everything externally to me, then I would be happy. It's a classic, like, I mean, we're brought up in this way, and it's nothing to be ashamed of, because really that is the way that our society is built, to believe that if we perfect everything on the outside, then we'll be good. And I spent a long time doing that. And it wasn't really until I started to recognize that it sounds such a cliche. And I remember reading stuff like this before I got into this work. I was like, shut up. But this whole thing about like, it is all about your relationship with yourself. And it sounds such a cliche, but it's like the more we look outward, is like, that's never going to fix it. Change the job, change the relationship, change the house, change the whatever, like you're still yourself. You can't, it's like, I remember my brother saying to me, because once I was like, I'm going to move to Australia. And he was like, Lucy, you realise if you move to Australia, you're still you. Like you're still in your brain. So your brain is not going to disappear.
Yeah, totally.
Like, oh, yeah.
I remember before I'd really stepped into doing a lot of inner work, I was saying like, I just want to move countries, or I just want to go somewhere else. I was like, I just want to leave my brain behind, if possible. I just need a holiday from my own head. That's what I need.
Yeah.
Completely. Yeah. And it's funny. I remember actually you talking about the cliche lines that kind of really resonated with you early on to do the work. I remember sitting at my desk and watching a YouTube video, and one of the lines in there, it was like a self-development motivational video, and one of the lines was, if you are not pursuing your goals, you are actively committing spiritual suicide. And I was like, oh my God, I'm slowly killing myself on a soul level. I need to get my shit together. Oh my God. But it's totally true. It's like when we're not going after the things that we love, if we're not looking at the stuff that's happening within us that's really, really in alignment with like the essence of who we are in some way like denying ourselves ultimate love and connection and fulfillment, right?
Yeah. And it's something that I see really often with clients actually, is this like this real sense of like, oh, something's not right, I don't feel happy. And part of it, I think Gabor Mate talks about this, like part of it is like there's a disconnection from essence. So there's a disconnection from true self. And true self is telling you like, go and do, not necessarily work-wise, but like go and start writing, or start like painting, or start dancing, or whatever it might be. But we stop doing it. I had a really interesting conversation with a woman the other day who is on this similar personal development path. And she's still got a full-time job. She's still doing her thing. But through doing this work, she reconnected to drawing. And she started this Instagram account with like drawing cartoons, basically. And she was like, I just remember as a kid, like I loved drawing. And then something stopped me doing it. Like there was something that happened at some point where I thought I shouldn't do this, or I'm not good enough to do this. And I stopped. And she almost pinpointed, she was like, when I stopped drawing, that was when I started to feel low. And then it just got progressively worse. It's incredible. Like there's a beautiful podcast with Glennon Doyle that I'll need to send you the link for, but it talks about this like disconnection from creativity and how we're all actually super creative, but we at some point will have heard a narrative of like, you shouldn't do this, or you're not quite good enough, or you compare yourself to someone else in your class or whatever, and we shut that part of ourselves down. And then there's just this part of us that's like, I just want to be expressed, like I just want a voice. And the more we box it, the more painful it becomes.
Well, it's the same, like Julia Cameron who wrote The Artist's Way.
Oh yeah.
That's exactly it. It's like we are all creative, and the idea that just some of us are creative and talented and other of us aren't is complete bollocks, because that's us measuring it on a good and bad scale. And if you are not extremely talented and therefore your artwork is exceptional or your music is going to sell millions of records, there's no point in you contributing to this industry. Thank you very much. It's like that's the narrative we have, but actually that denies your average person the chance to connect exactly as you're saying, like connect to their essence. And it's so funny that you just mentioned that, because as a child I drew all the time, all the time, and was super creative. I used to sit and write essays, like creative essays for fun. I would just write stories, and I even started writing a book as a child. I was just super creative, and it was like, and then I went on to study art history. And I feel for me, like wanting to study art history was a way of me wanting to connect to something. Like art moved me. And then I think that somewhere along the way, I just lost that sense of connection. And that's when the kind of deadening, I think, started, like the numbing.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And I don't draw at all, but maybe I should start again.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember really clearly, like, I don't think I ever remember really loving writing as a kid, but I stopped writing because I wasn't even particularly avert, but I remember in English lessons not being particularly good at English. And because I was like, I have to be the best, I just gave up. I was like, I don't like this subject. I'm clearly bad at it. I don't like writing essays. So there was a part of my brain that was almost like, you are not creative. Like anything to do with writing is not for you. And then when I went to South America and I was like, actually, I feel like there's a lot of stuff that wants to come out about my experience of life. I started writing, and it was literally like, it was just like pouring out of me and seemingly connected to people. And I was like, how is it? It's so sad that I had blocked that for such a long time, because I had this narrative in my head that was like, you're not creative. You can't do that. You have to go and do serious things and like numerical things, because that's who you are and your identity. So limited.
Totally. And it's funny how even with things like creativity, and I see it as well in like meditation and yoga, ways that we can connect to ourselves on a deeper level, we still bring so much shame into that. It's like, oh, I'm not good enough at drawing. I'm not good enough at meditation. I'm not good enough at yoga. It's like yoga is just you moving your body, and meditation is you just sitting quietly. So how can you be bad at these things? It's like we still bring that judgment of good and bad to ways that we can connect with ourselves, which is, it's such a kind of societal shame that we do that. But maybe that's just an invitation for us to just to reclaim those things.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like it's a space of wanting to be accepted, really, like wanting to be accepted for our creativity rather than it just being an expression of ourselves, and allowing that. Like, what is it that Glennon Doyle shares? She's like, you just create your art and put it out there and don't worry about where it goes, rather than it being like, this art is me and it needs to be accepted by other people. I need validation for it. It's that whole thing of trying to get validation externally again. Whereas if it's like, I've really enjoyed creating this, I don't care if someone hates it. It was an expression of myself, and it was an expression of my deeper essence, or whatever you believe it to be, and that is enough.
Totally. I mean, that even came up around me podcasting, and I did a therapy session on it, and was like, I don't know why, I can't seem to push this out into the world. And she was like, well, what's your hang up about it? I was like, what if no one listens? She was like, well, why are you doing it? Like, for fun, because I like speaking to my friends and people who I know, and I know some really interesting people, and I just like having a chat with them. So for me, this is fun. She was like, well, if it's just fun art, then why don't you just do that? No one even has to listen. If anyone listens, it's a bonus. If it's just for the expression of you enjoying yourself and doing a thing, then that's it. But you're right. It's like, the external validation comes in so hard. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Oh God, this conversation could go on for hours, but it also feels like it connects to that whole thing of like choosing joy, of just being like, okay, I'm going to do this because it's joyful, and that is fine. It doesn't need to have an outcome. It doesn't need to be like praise. It doesn't need to be anything. It's just because it brings me joy. And that's enough.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you feel when you were working in banking, and you mentioned that you weren't happy within yourself? What do you feel like you were searching for? Do you think it was a deeper sense of connection, or what would you say that you were searching for?
There are two answers to this, because there's the answer of what I know now and the answer of what my brain was telling me at the time.
Both.
Both. Okay. At the time, my brain was telling me that I was searching for a man, I think, because I was like, everything else, basically it comes back to this perfectionism thing. It's like everything else in my life is perfect. Like, I've got this good job, I've got a good salary, I've got a nice flat, The piece that's missing is a man. So that must be the thing that's wrong. And once I find that, then everything will be great. So I think I was searching for, in essence, love at that point, and thinking that could probably come externally. If I look back now with what I know now, I again was searching for love, but I now equate that to a deeper connection with myself. And what's happened for me anyway, in turn, with being more deeply connected with myself, is the circle of people that are around me. I don't want to say has elevated, because that seems like the wrong word, but like it feels as if my connections are much deeper. So I feel seen much more, and I feel, to be honest, more accepted, because I can share my gritty parts with people and they can meet me there. But that wouldn't have come without me doing my own inner stuff.
And acceptance starts with us as well, right? Because even if the people around us accept us, if we're not accepting ourselves on a deep level, we're not going to feel accepted. And if we're not fully seeing ourselves, we're not going to feel seen by others. So
exactly.
Yeah, it all just comes back to doing that for ourselves first, and then putting that out, and that will come back.
Yeah.
So in our society now, it seems like there is just so much generalized anxiety, a widespread depression. The mental health rates or emotional well-being rates are pretty average to poor, I would say. And what do you think that's down to? I mean, we've talked about disconnection, we've talked about external validation. Like, what do you think is going on like a kind of collective consciousness level to create such a kind of sense of like discontent across the board for a lot of people?
That's a big question. I feel like I have two answers for this. One of them is, I think that we live in a society where, unfortunately, we have been trained to expect that the external will make us happy. And that has been compounded year after year after year after year, and for however long. So now it almost feels, I hope, that we're at the peak of this now, and that it will start to crumble. But this peak of people starting to recognize, like, I have, in the West anyway, I have everything really, but I'm not happy. So that's more like on a surface type level. I think on a deeper level, it's this sense, which links quite clearly to that, is a real disconnect from self. And a real disconnect. This came from my Ayurveda teacher, and I don't know what it was when she said it to me. It was like the penny drop. She said, in the root chakra, which for people that aren't aware of energy stuff is like the survival center, grounding center, which is right at the base of the spine, and develops quite young. It's made up of 3 different pillars. So it's made up of the pillar of nutrition, sex, and spirituality. And for a lot of us, we try and find, like, we have to have those 3 pillars satisfied in order to feel balanced. And for a lot of us, the spiritual pillar is missing. So we try and find satisfaction through food, nutrition, alcohol, like sugar, whatever, and sex. So overindulgence in those 2 things, but actually recognizing that they will never fulfill us. So we keep going round and round in circles, being like, oh, I'll keep going to those things, but actually not realizing that the difficulty or the thing that's missing is the spiritual pillar. And I used to have a real aversion to the word spirituality before I got into this stuff, because it really linked to me to like quite dogmatic religion. But for me now, spirituality is literally just a connection to yourself and a connection to the wider universe, or whatever you deem some higher power to be. And that, I think, is what's missing now. And it's just become more and more painful over time because of people's wounds becoming deeper and deeper, because of the way the trauma gets passed down through generations. And we end up, like, our generation is holding a lot of stuff. So we're holding all of this stuff, but we don't have the connection to spirituality to help us offset that.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. There was a podcast between Russell Brand and Ricky Gervais. And Ricky Gervais is like an absolute diehard atheist. He believes that when he dies, he's dead, in the ground, goodbye, that's it. You know, doesn't believe in any sense of higher power, God, etc., etc. But what happened on the podcast was that Russell Brand really kind of dug deep into the beliefs of Ricky Gervais. And Ricky Gervais still believes in something greater than himself, in that he's a big vegan, he's a big animal lover, and he believes in nature and the world. Yeah. And he sees himself as very inconsequential in comparison to the wider world. And I think that, I mean, that is, it's not so much kind of, I mean, he doesn't believe it's spirituality, but it's still this connection of us and it's still this believing in something outside of ourselves and greater than ourselves, seeing ourselves as kind of limitless, but also tiny at the same time. And I think, you know, that's the thing that's potentially, I guess the thing for me was recognizing that I am part of something bigger, that the universe supports me, that I'm not alone. When I felt that, it stopped the kind of existential loneliness, I think, that I felt. Yeah. Because I used to feel so alone all of the time. And I felt, you know, what you've said, a lot of disconnection. I literally felt like a part of my brain, I was born without a part of my brain missing. Like maybe it just wasn't fused right. You know, I was trying to understand, like, everyone else seems really happy and seems really fulfilled and connected. And here I am with everything. And actually I still don't feel great. And I think that it was that connection of, feeling part of something bigger than myself that made me feel at home, I think, in this body and at home on this planet. And when people can establish that through whatever means necessary, even if you don't label it as a spirituality. No.
And I there's a really interesting book that I've just started reading because I listened to the podcast. That it's a lady called Dr. Lisa Miller, who's on Mo Gallup's podcast, and she's a neuroscientist, and she's written this book called The Awakened Brain. And they were doing studies into the link between depression and anxiety and spirituality to see whether actually people that had a spiritual belief system of whatever that might be, whether that was some kind of potentially helpful factor in reducing the risk of depression and anxiety. And the results are incredible. And I think it really links to the point you made of having this sense of of trust in something bigger and to not feel like you are so alone. Because I really resonate with that point that you made about feeling lonely. Like I never felt like I had serious mental health issues. I've been very fortunate in my life thus far that I didn't suffer in the way that I know that a lot of people do. But I do remember having moments of waking up in the middle of the night in this panic, feeling so alone, and this sense that I have to decide everything in my life, otherwise nothing is going to happen. And like, I'm so alone in this, and I'm alone in this experience of life, and I'm alone, like no one is really around me. And that was absolutely terrifying. And at the time I linked that to being single and not having a partner. And now I'm like, that was nothing to do with having a partner. It was to do with this disconnection from some belief system of like believing that you're supported, or believing that whatever you really believe, connection with community, connection with family, whatever it might be for people, but having that sense of connectedness, which actually loops back to what you were saying right at the start about people connecting through their flaws and connecting through the struggles, of like, the more we can connect in that space, the less alone we feel with our deeper, more gritty selves.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that you've done a lot of trauma related work as well, which I find fascinating, because I'm definitely getting like more into trauma, if we can say that.
I know, it's a weird thing to get into, isn't it?
Yeah, I really, really dig it.
So interested in trauma.
Gabor Mate, I absolutely love, and his documentary Wisdom of Trauma, and the book also, The Body Keeps the Score. There's so much now that is kind of coming to light on trauma, and I know that it's something that, you know, you've done a lot of work on. How did you start that work?
This is okay. So this was another retreat that I was on, and I went on lots of retreats because I was like, all my friends are going on holiday with their partners and I'm all alone. So I went on yoga retreats, and I went on this retreat, and I was talking to this woman about like my life, I think. And I started talking about school, and I don't know why I was started talking about school, because I was like 27 at the time. And I just started crying. And I was like, this is a bit weird. Why am I crying about something that happened a very long time ago? And she worked in trauma, like micro trauma world. And she said, she was like, I think you've got mild PTSD. And I honestly, I laughed in her face. I was like, I don't have PTSD. What the hell are you talking about? Because in my mind, PTSD was like, it was for war veterans, basically. Yeah. Like, you don't have PTSD unless you've been through something severe. Like, I don't have PTSD. And then interestingly, I can't remember if I've already shared this with you, but she did EFT on me on this experience that we've been talking about. And I sobbed, like properly sobbed, when she was talking me through this whole thing. And it was almost like I woke up out of that. Like, when I opened my eyes at the end of the session, I was like, the world looks different. Like, something has changed. I don't know what has changed, but something has changed. And this is the experience that a lot of clients have, I'm sure, through your EFT, through breathwork, through any of these types of modalities. And after that, I was like, right, I need to understand this stuff. So I started to dive more and more into it, because I wanted to, at the time, I wanted to rid myself of this, like, whatever it was that was in me that was creating all of these behavioral patterns, and became more and more interested in it. And I also started to recognize patterns in people around me that I was like, God, I think this might also be linked to this stuff. And I think I now live in an echo chamber where everybody talks about trauma, and it's like, oh, it's just, you know, everyone knows about their traumas, but there is still a huge cohort of society that have no idea about any of this stuff. And I feel like it's so important to help educate people about this, and help people to look at their stuff and to heal in a way that is supportive and compassionate and loving, which I think happens a lot in healing modalities. Like holding compassionate space for people in their processes.
One of the most fascinating things that I learned in my EFT training was that your belief systems are mostly established by the time that you are 6. So between 0 and 6, that's when we decide what the world looks like to us. That's when we decide. That's by that point we've already established the majority of the ways that we feel within ourselves, our ability to connect to others, our understanding of the world as being safe or non-safe. And yes, those belief systems can be changed through EFT, through breathwork, through hypnosis, you know, whatever it is. But we're all just walking around in these kind of little children bodies, essentially. You know, like my 5-year-old version of the world is also playing out in my conscious mind, because the 99% of what we do or what we think or what we feel is a reflection of our subconscious, which is established very, very early on in life. So trauma is just, it's so important within any kind of healing, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is crazy. So within that age period, the brain is actually in a brainwave which mirrors what you're in hypnosis. Yeah. So it's literally like you're absorbing all this stuff and it's creating your paradigm for life. And then you just carry on through life believing all of those things that were set. And I read something really interesting this morning that was talking about how oftentimes, and I think this can be quite a big breakthrough for people when they're doing healing work or they just start getting into it, of looking at triggers that happen in our lives. So say something really irritates us about someone, we get into an argument with someone and we're really annoyed about it, to actually understand that, and this used to come up for me a lot at work, like I'd get really annoyed with my boss, or I'd feel like I had to really please my boss, like desperate to please my boss. And then when I realized that actually, this is when it all gets a bit messed up, my boss in my child mind was my dad. So it was like, what was actually going on was child Lucy was trying to get approval of her dad. And because my boss was in a position of power and was like, there was almost like a father-daughter dynamic, which I think it comes up so much with my clients, this sense of like, oh, wow, I react at work in a way which is similar to how I reacted in my dynamic with my parents. And as soon as we start to recognize that, it's like, oh my God, like all of my relationships are like this. Like romantic relationships can be like this as well. Like we can fall into this pattern of like, oh, needing approval from our partners to do things because we've somehow decided that our partners is actually our dads, which all sounds a bit messed up, but it's like the way that the mind works is incredible. And that is why it's so important to do the healing work, because otherwise we get into these weird dynamics, which the other person might not even be aware of. Yeah.
And we spend our whole lifetimes trying to heal something on a conscious or subconscious level. So we might as well make it conscious, right? We might as well be aware what our shit is.
Exactly.
That we can bring it out there. Okay, so if somebody listening to this was actually thinking, holy shit, I'm actually not happy in my life. I feel this hole within myself too. I feel lonely. I feel disconnected. What would you say is like, what's your advice of kind of how to start? Because I know for me, I was a bit like, I don't know how, I didn't know how to start. And for me, what that looked like was I started going to yoga. And then I was just on the path by then, and very fortunate for me, like the right people showed up at the right time, and then I did this and then I did that and blah, blah, blah. But I know that it can feel a bit like, where do I even start? I've got all these feelings. I don't know where to go. And I live in maybe a society kind of where if you've been brought up in a certain way or have lots of expectations upon you, and it can be quite hard to break out of that. So what would you say is kind of your, what wisdom would you impart there?
I mean, it's hard to give advice because everybody is so different and everybody has their own ways of looking at things. I think it can be supportive to work with someone if you've never done it before. If you have the financial means to do it, to work with someone can be supportive. If you don't have financial means, there are so many incredible books, like so many books. And to just start by, rather than being like, oh my God, I've got all this trauma and I now feel like I have all this stuff, just start to like educate yourself on some of this stuff. And it doesn't need to be like really sciencey or psychology books. Like I remember reading The 4 Agreements and The Untethered Soul quite early on, and The Power of Now. And they gave me some sense of like softness and support. Because it's a lifelong journey, really. It's not like you can just suddenly go, oh, okay, like I'm now just going to fix all this stuff. Just starting slowly and starting to like, now there are so many resources out there online. There are incredible people to follow on Instagram, amazing podcasts, like just dive into all of that stuff, really. And I really believe too, like that we come from a world where there was always this outsourcing of power. So like, okay, I need to find a psychologist, or I need to find a whatever, and they're going to fix me. And I don't really buy into that anymore. So a lot of the work that I do with people is to try and help them to recognize that actually they're their own best healer. And the more we can educate ourselves about our bodies and our needs and understand our patterns, like we know ourselves better than anyone else. And working with someone in the initial stages can be really supportive, but just starting to educate yourself, basically.
Yeah.
And then do anything that can get you into your body. That's the other thing. Like any kind of body practice, like it doesn't need to be yoga or meditation or whatever. It can be like football, whatever, just something to get you into your physical body.
Yeah, love that, because I know that because we spend so much time up in our heads, so many people feel so disconnected from their bodies. So even just doing like shakeout practice, cathartic movement, just getting into our bodies, because all the wisdom's in the body. And all the repression as well as in the body, like all the emotions that are stuck there and stuff, that's when things start to loosen. When I just talking to books, I started reading spiritual books, I guess, in my mid-20s, when I was trying to have some kind of a life shift and didn't know how the fuck to go about it. My mum gifted me a book called Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, which was written, I think, in like the 60s or something, which was amazing. And then I read The Alchemist. And that spoke to me, obviously the most popular book on the planet. And then other books, like I read Gabby Bernstein's The Universe Has Your Back, and I just wept the whole way through, just because it seemed to like just touch my soul in some kind of way.
Yeah.
But you're right, there is so much out there. And yes, it can be amazing to work with somebody. And so I have benefited from working with so many coaches, healers, teachers, mentors, etc. But I think that a big flick switch, I think, in my coaching early on was realizing that I wasn't trying to make anybody else more like me. I was trying to make somebody more like them. Yeah. And I think that that's a thing to be wary of too, with like social media now. There's so much noise, isn't there? And it can be so difficult to discern who's a good person to follow and blah, blah, blah. But like, I think just allowing ourselves to really give permission to be more of ourselves, as opposed to going into more self-development to become more like somebody else. Yeah. You know, it's actually having that intention of, I'm doing this to discover the truth of who I am, as opposed to trying to mold myself into another version of what somebody else thinks that I should look like. Exactly. So it's kind of being really intentional with that. There was just one more thing that I really wanted to ask you, which was, I know that making big transitions in our lives can be really, really challenging. And I'm sure that you found this of coming from a background of, you know, you studied chemistry at uni and then you'd done banking for 9 years, and then suddenly you're like leaving to do like breathwork and coaching. Like everyone's a bit like, what the fuck? And I had the same. Like I went to Cambridge and studied art history. I then went into insurance, and my life was very much kind of nicely set out ahead of me. And then when I decided that I wanted to become a yoga teacher, everyone was like, are you okay? Are you having some life crisis? Do you need some help? What do you need? And there was obviously a lot of kind of concern amongst family, friends, Megan's having a breakdown type thing. How did you move past that? Like, how did you kind of get permission to do it? I mean, for me, I needed somebody to almost give me permission and tell me that it was okay for me to do this, because I was like on the edge of my seat, wanting to make such a big change in my life and just go in a totally different direction. But what it took for me was actually, I met up with my father one night, we went for dinner, and bearing in mind that the majority of our conversations over the past few years had become increasingly more focused upon how unhappy I was becoming. And then eventually at this one dinner, I just sat down and cried and was like, I'm so unhappy. Like, I don't like my job. I don't like where I am. My life is not how I envisaged it to look. And my father said to me, bearing in mind that, you know, I up to that point thought that my father was quite traditional and wanted me to stay in this forum that made me unhappy. And he said, why don't you just do something radical? I was like, what do you mean radical? He was like, well, why don't you, he was like, what do you want to do? And I said, I just want to move to Australia and just teach yoga. And he was like, well, why don't you just do that then? Just try it. Why don't you just go off and do that? And to me, it was just like someone had just pulled away like the curtain, and I could just have this permission to actually step into this life that I wanted to step into. But I did actually need that permission. Like for you, how did you kind of muster the courage to make leaps, or did you need permission, or how did you deal with the judgment and expectations of others? Yeah.
I'm so impressed that you had that conversation. First of all, I definitely felt the sense that I needed permission. And I spent the whole of my 20s thinking that I needed permission to do everything that I wanted to do. I think that I had done, not that I had got to this point where I was like, I've done so much work that I can do anything now without needing permission. It definitely brought up resistance in me. But I was really lucky that I was away for those 3 months, and I was almost surrounded by, it was almost like having like a group of cheerleaders that were all like, Lucy, you don't belong in an office. Like, you just don't. That is just clearly, for people that hadn't ever known me before, they couldn't believe that I worked in banking. Like, it just doesn't make any sense at all. And that really helped me, I think, because I suddenly was like, I felt like I had this squad of people behind me that supported me in it. And then I really, really resonate with you, because I spent a long time trying to get approval from my parents. Like, I really wanted them to support everything I did. And one of the reasons that, to be honest, I was in banking was because I thought that would make them proud. And it was weird because I don't think I ever asked for their permission. But once I left, I remember my dad saying to me, he was like, Lucy, it's just not a way to live a life. Like, and he did it for his whole career. He was like, it's just not. And that's not to say that people shouldn't stay in those jobs, but just, I think he recognized in me that it wasn't making me happy. And it's such a cliche again. It's like, the reality is most people just want you to be happy. But doing enough of your own stuff to recognize that is more important, really. And having, the other thing I think is having a group of people around you that are doing similar things is really helpful too. But I recognize that, like, transitions are difficult. They are, and especially big life transitions, it can bring up so much fear. And I resigned at the beginning of COVID, so I was suddenly like, oh my God, what have I done? This is a disaster. I need my job back. And that is where it was so important to have community around me and like my own practices to manage fear and stuff, because it was intense.
Yeah, definitely. And needing permission and seeking approval and wanting to just stay in what we're doing at whatever cost to ourselves just to make somebody else proud, that's like a trauma in itself, isn't it? It's like, in order to make these leaps, we often have to process all of that stuff first. And just by making big changes in our lives, it is actually doing a lot of the work. But yeah, I definitely needed permission from someone, anyone could have given me permission.
And probably, if I think about it, the people that I was with in South America gave me that permission. Because they boosted me enough. Because at the time I was teaching yoga whilst we were on this trip, so I was teaching the group like a couple of times a week, and that allowed me to step into like a different version of myself. And I was like, oh, I actually feel a bit better being in this like loving space rather than being the hard-nosed businesswoman that it was like a mask that I'd created for myself that wasn't a very nice mask for me to wear. I didn't feel particularly comfortable, but it was very shiny.
To confirm, you do feel better now, don't you?
I do feel better now. I remember the same woman that did the EFT thing on me. She said to me, she was like, you're very brittle. I was like, what do you mean? She's like, it's like you've got this really hard exterior, and if we just like cracked it a little bit, it would all crumble. And I now don't feel quite as brittle. I feel like more solid in myself. There's less of a weird mask that I'm wearing to hide myself.
Awesome. Love that. So do you feel like there was anything else that you had to push through in order to make a big shift in your life?
A lot of it was money. I had to change the view that basically earning lots of money would make me happy, and the fear of not having a salary. That was massive. And that took quite a lot of work, and it continues to take work, to step away from the idea that unless I'm in a high paid job, I'm a failure. And I continue to work with that like every day. And then on top of that, which was my initial answer, I had to start looking at a lot of the relationships that were surrounding me, which is not easy to do at all, because I think when you start to work on yourself, I started to recognize that there were certain patterns in some of my relationships that weren't very healthy, and not in any way against those people. It was me that for some reason I was showing up in those relationships in like a people-pleasing way, or in a way that was not actually conducive to me stepping into a different, new, more empowered version of myself. And the more that I spent time in those circles, it kind of felt like it was pulling me backwards. And I was lucky in a way, because of COVID, that I had a bit of space from that naturally, because we were all in lockdown. But that has been really challenging for me, because a lot of people have been in my life for a really long time, and it is nothing against those people. They're all wonderful. It was me that I had created these relationships on the foundation of me needing to please them, me needing to be a certain version of myself, and stepping away from that was really hard. Really hard.
Yeah. And that's definitely a challenging thing to navigate as you change, as you shift, as you expand or elevate, or whatever you want to call within yourself. There is a shift with those around you and your relationships, your friendships and stuff. And I think that a useful perspective of that as well is like, when we can let certain things go, it creates space for other things to come in. And it doesn't mean we have to let go of old things completely. Sometimes we do let go of old things, but sometimes the dynamics just change. But it's all the time just creating new space for us to step into more and more and more true versions of ourselves. Yeah. And I think that holding on to that belief really helps during the letting go process, because otherwise letting go can be really painful.
Really hard.
And I mean, it is really hard. But I think holding on to that, as things fall away, it is just allowing you to step into the more authentic expression of you. Yeah. It really helps.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we obviously make friends through like primary school, we make friends at secondary school, we make friends at university, we then make friends at work, and then we kind of just go into this like linear thing. And I think I had an expectation that I would only ever make friends up until like my first job, and then those were my friends, and that was just it. And actually, to be honest, I've had so many incredible people come into my life over the last few years, and that is actually a more natural evolution of the human life in my eyes, of like, people come into your life, people come out of your life, and trying to, which is incredibly hard to do, trying to have less attachment to like, things need to be solid and stable, and people need to be in my life forever, because otherwise I'm not safe. Having more of a trust of like, people come and go, and that's okay, because coming back full circle, because I'm okay in myself.
Yeah, I love that. Impermanence and non-attachment, like the Buddhists really nailed it, didn't they?
Yeah, they did nail it. I know. It's the most difficult thing to master, but
I know.
God, the freedom if you could actually do it fully.
I know. It's like we're all here just trying to work it all out, but actually, like the very old ancient lineages really worked it out quite early on.
They did.
Oh, all right, my love. Well, thank you so much for all of your time. So much appreciated, and for sharing all of your wisdom too. If anybody would like to connect with you more in terms of your work, your breathwork, coaching, what is the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Best way to find me is on Instagram. So I'm at Lucy_Puttergill. and I am quite active on there. I'm also active on LinkedIn. If people are more on LinkedIn, just with my name, and then that's the best way, basically. I also have a website, but I'm more likely to be contactable through those two means.
Perfect. Yeah, I love your Instagram. You're so good every day. Amazing.
Well, I think I might be taking a break next week, but we'll see.
Oh well, all good.
Yeah.
All right, my love. Thank you so much, and I'll speak to you soon. Big love.
Thank you so much.